There is also much proof and many documents to sustain the fact that Bacon and Andre and Campanella were in communication with each other. And it is quite possible that a good many of these utopian productions arose in a common factory of the minds, inspired by a definite purpose. And that purpose was to support and advance the universal Reformation as expounded in the Fama and Confessio Fraternitatis. In any event, the New Atlantis has been tied in many ways to the Rosicrucian problem. John Hayden, who wrote about 1660 and claimed to have a considerable knowledge of the Rosicrucians, published the New Atlantis as a Rosicrucian fable, changing only a few words and introducing the word Rosy Cross in 2 or 3 places where it is not in Bacon's original text. Now, this has caused a considerable amount of controversy also. In 1660, we must assume that the Lord Bacon's works were rather well known in England. In fact, we know that most of them have passed through several editions, and that the Royal Society, which was based upon Bacon's original concepts, was beginning to take shape and influence English thinking. Therefore, we cannot assume that the English people were unaware of the New Atlantis. And it is more or less foolish to also assume that Hayden could have hoped that his plagiarization would pass undetected. There seems to be more reason to suppose that either Hayden himself believed that the New Atlantis was a Rosicrucian fable and therefore felt justified in making these changes, or else he was party to some knowledge and actually knew that Lord Bacon's fable was intended to be a Rosicrucian work. So we come now to the New Atlantis itself, and I think we have an interesting project on our hands. Here is the first edition of the New Atlantis, published in 1627 as the appendix to Lord Bacon's Silva Silvarum, or the Natural History of Winds in 10 Centuries. It is described on the title page, The New Atlantis, a Work Unfinished, written by the Right Honorable Francis Lord Verulam, Viscount St. Alban. In the lower part of the title page, there is a rather interesting vignette. This vignette shows the figure of time, now presented almost in the form of Pan, but as an aged man, with the lower members resembling those of a goat, carrying also the scythe, accompanied by the hourglass, and drawing a female figure from a cavern, which is to be found at the viewer's left of the picture. The Latin motto which surrounds this central device reads that in time all that is hidden shall be made known. This opens a very interesting point, because we know that it was upon the model of this New Atlantis College that the Royal Society of England was later founded. And Spratt, in his History of the Royal Society, definitely declares that the inspiration of it was derived from Bacon's College of the 6 Days' Work. We also know that Newton and many other important men of his time, scientists and architects, leaders of thought, belonged to a group called the Society of the Unknown Philosophers. This has likewise been traced, and we find that it arose among the same group that later integrated the Royal Society. Thus, out of the College of the 6 Days' Work, an actual physical institution did ultimately spring. But this institution was only a fragment of the original invention. It was evident from this preface of Raleigh's that Bacon had in mind creating the archetype or pattern of a great system of education, and that therefore it was not to be regarded merely as a fable, nor even as a utopia in the popular sense of that time, It was not just a story of men seeking for a better world. It had to do with something which in the development of the account we are impelled to assume already had an existence. And that like several of these other utopias, these distant places hidden from men implied perhaps a secret society or a secret association of persons that actually did exist, as in the case of the guilds, where the concept of a social commonwealth existed long before it burst through to become a political equation in European history. Plato, of course, in his preparation of the Atlantis account, also ends in the middle of a sentence. His concept of the Atlantis is also a work unfinished, just as Lord Bacon's was. And there may be intent or reason for this. It may be, in truth, that the stories both deal with an unfinished product that only time can finish, as only time can place the capstone on the mysterious pyramid on the United States seal. And there are also others who, perfecting knowledge within the mysteries and confines of Solomon's house, do in secret go back and diffuse that knowledge in other lands without revealing where it comes from. So that this house of wisdom is a kind of secret house raised in the world, to which persons can go under certain conditions, but only under certain conditions. Now, in most of the utopias, these conditions are approximately the same. The individual must be shipwrecked, or he must be totally lost, or he must be on the verge of terrible disaster, when there is no longer any hope of his being saved, as in the case of these sailing people, who, having no longer any provision, were on the verge of death when they found this safe harbor. I think the implication of this is rather obvious, that Solomon's house, or the mystery of true knowledge, is not to be found except in extremity, in some terrible emergency in which the human being, despairing of survival, is in this very despair brought into contact with the elements of his own preservation. The general theme behind all the utopias is that men will not turn to this kind of essential knowledge until they despair of survival by any other means. That by nature the individual is self-centered and self-purposed, that he will continue in his present courses as long as he can endure them. And it is only when he recognizes the immediacy of an ultimate disaster that he prays earnestly and genuinely for salvation. And having thus addressed heaven, having in this way sincerely opened his heart, becoming thus humble in his own spirit, then he discovers rising before him the blessed city of the utopias. It is hoped in Bacon's thinking, and certainly in his concept of the Royal Society, this is clearly brought out, that gradually all knowledge, particularly among Western nations, will be brought closer and closer into harmony with one grand, universal, idealistic concept. That it will no longer be necessary for man to dichotomize between religious knowledge and material knowledge. That man shall recognize one world, one universe in which he exists. That this universe is a continuous interplay of spiritual and material factors. That one is not essentially superior to the other. But that in this integration, the purpose of it all, the reason behind it all, is that man himself shall come to know all that it is necessary and possible for him to know. And to achieve this, he has got to change the foundations of his knowing. The essential knowledge is that man shall become a completely enlightened creature. That man himself shall become self-sustaining in space. That he shall have conscious association with the larger universe around him, shall recognize his citizenship in space, and shall no longer be a lonely traveler shipwrecked on a desert island. That he shall no longer be this lost wanderer hunting for a utopia. The great solution lies in the need of the direct thing. And the only answer to this need is that all attention should be devoted to the exploration of man's internal resources, so that from a full knowledge of man's own inner structure, we shall be able to build within him a foundation upon which his character can stand and upon which all other labors can be accomplished. And the implication in the new Atlantis is that we will find in man, under the spiritual dominion of consciousness itself, this great assembly of the learned, that the master of Solomon's house is consciousness itself, and that if we are able to find this consciousness, if we are able to find this core, we shall then come to essential knowledge. And having achieved this, and having protected our destinies and the destinies of our kinds from any emergency or catastrophe, we may then have our amusements. We may have our idols, be they of the marketplace or of the cave.
Now, eternity, or unaging time, gives birth to time, as we know it by a mystery. And the firstborn of heaven was Cronus, or Saturn. And Saturn is time. And it is time that turns and unthrones its own father, taking upon itself the control of the universe, and forces its own will upon creation. So Saturn, or time, or Cronus, rebels against eternity and usurps the kingdom. And from that time, all things are the slaves of time. Now, to the Greeks, time was not just a dimension, something that you measure on a clock. Time was a living thing. And it is not impossible that we shall ultimately come to this same realization, that time is a creature with a body, a form, and a kind, and that time will never be solved, or its mystery will never be understood, until we realize that time is a conscious entity, and not merely a flowing of years, as we think of it. But because Saturn is time, and because time has within itself the power to absorb everything which is created within it, Saturn devours all of his own children, because time absorbs or dissolves or destroys or returns to itself everything which is engendered from it. For nothing that is born in time can have an eternal duration. So that which is part of time dies in time. Worlds, having fallen under the yoke of time, must be dissolved. All compounds existing within time must again be resolved into their basic elements.